Hello, everybody. My name is Yitzchak Etshalom. I'm delighted to be teaching from Los Angeles through Toronto to the rest of the world. We're going to take a look at an absolutely central um, piece in Breshit that one could argue is the most central passage, not only in Breshit, but maybe in all of Tanakh, vis-a-vis Jewish history. So I'm going to jump ahead to that passage in the middle, and then we're going to look at another piece in this. If you take a look at Pasuk Yod Gimel, and you have it in English here also, Pasuk Yod Gimel begins 4 verses, which are the core of the event that we're going to study about tonight, which is called Brit Bein HaBetarim, the covenant between the pieces. When we go over it, we're going to look at it and see why it's called the covenant between the pieces. But for right now, the main piece, which if you were in a class that I was giving you a grade for, you'd have to memorize these 4 verses, and I'd come up to you at the lunch table or in the gym and say recite, and you'd have to recite. So I guess you could thank God that you're not in that situation. Vayomer le'Avram, Hashem says to Avram, Yadoa teda ki ger yeh zaracha be'eretz lo lahem, va'avadum ve'inu otam 400 shana. So you should know for sure that your children or your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land. They will be enslaved and oppressed for a very long time. 400 shana is a biblical way of saying a really long time. And the nation that enslaves them, I will judge, meaning I'll punish the nation that oppresses them, that enslaves them. And afterwards, they, your children, will leave with great wealth. You, Avram, will come to your fathers in peace, which means you're going to die without seeing any of this trouble. Tikaver b'seva tova, you'll die. You'll be buried at a good old age. Seva, same word as Saba, old age. V'dor revi'i yashuvu. Now the 4th generation, unclear fourth from what, but the 4th generation will return here to the land. Kilo shalem avon amoriyah, because the sin of those will not be complete until that point. Meaning that your children cannot return and inherit the land until the locals have really lost their rights to the land, which God says prophetically, after 4 generations, whenever that time is, they will have lost that right, and your children will be able to come and inherit it. Now, how do we interpret this in retrospect? Meaning, we know a lot more of Jewish history than Avram knew, because he's at the beginning of it, and we are where we are. What is this phrase, what is this passage prophesizing about, or telling us about? So I know that if you were able to hit your mics, you would say Mitzrayim. It's all about Yetziat Mitzrayim, correct? They're going to be strangers in a foreign land. They're going to be enslaved. They're going to be oppressed for a really long time. And God punishes the nation that oppresses them. And they leave with great wealth. And the 4th generation returns. Beautiful. So 2 questions. First of all, did Bnei Yisrael at the time know that? And did people before that know that? Did they say, we have a family tradition that we're supposed to go to Egypt at some point and be enslaved and oppressed, but then we're going to leave with great wealth and there'll be all sorts of makot against Mitzrayim? Or do they not know that? But I'm going to ask a bigger question, which is this nevuah really about Mitzrayim? Well, actually, in the Haggadah, we say it's not. We say it's not. In the Haggadah Shel Pesach, we have a passage, Baruch Shomer Avtachato LiYisrael Baruch Hu. We thank God who keeps his promise. Shakadosh Baruch Hu mechashev et haketz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is always calculating the end. Lasot kama shamar l'Avraham Avinu b'Brit ben HaBetarim, to fulfill what he said in Brit ben HaBetarim. And we quote the first 2 verses. And what do we say immediately after we quote these verses? V'hi she'amda la'avotenu v'lanu. And this is the Brit that stood for our ancestors. Why? It's not only one person tried to destroy us, but in every generation they try to destroy us, as we see right now. HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu mi'adam, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu saves us, as we see right now. So we have a generic understanding, a mainstream understanding, that this Brit is not about a singular event or a singular exile, but rather, or single exile, it's about a cycle of Jewish history. That Egypt may be one and maybe the most explicit example of, but not the only one. So just a piece about what's at the center of this. But let's scroll back to the beginning. And as you see, we're going to look at the whole chapter, which is all of 21 verses. It's not that long. And we're going to see something very bizarre happen in the middle. And you see that I'm a Vincent van Gogh fan. And so the question is this Starry Night or followed by sunset in Montmajour, or what's going on? How do you have a starry night followed by sunset? And that's the core of the problem we're going to deal with. But it's going to open up doors into much bigger issues. Let's take a look. This is immediately after the war that Avraham fought against 4 invading empires from the east, who came and took pretty much everybody in the coastal plain on both sides of the Jordan captive, and ransacked their cities, and was moving north with them to return with their spoils. And it was essentially those kings putting down a tax rebellion. It's commonly known as the War of the 4 Kings versus the 5 Kings, but that's really misleading because the 4 kings are 4 huge empires and the 5 kings are kings of little nothing, the king of a town, right? It's like Russia, the United States, China, and Germany going to war against Monaco and Liechtenstein and Staten Island, or whatever. Okay, hope nobody's from Staten Island. Anyhow, all right. So after this war, Hayad Dvar Adonai el Avram b'machazeh lemor. Hashem speaks to Avram in a machazeh. A machazeh is a vision. It's the first time that word is used anywhere in Tanakh, and it's the first time it's used certainly in the context of Avram, who God has spoken to before. But now there's a vision. And what does he say? Al tira Avram, anochi magen lach. Don't worry, Avram, I'm going to protect you. Scharcha harbe meod. You have a great reward. And there's 2 ways to read this. One is, I will protect you and you have a great reward, or I will protect you and therefore you'll have a great reward. And those are 2 separate things or one. Now, what's the protection? So most Rishonim understand that it refers to protection from any vengeance or retribution from the kings that Avraham beat. I'll protect you from them. And you have a great reward. Vayomer Avram, so Avram says, Adonai Elohim. Now, notice how Hashem's name is spelled there. Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yod. It's the first time in Tanakh it's spelled that way. Adonai Elohim. Ma titein li. What's the point of giving me anything? V'hanochi holei chariri. I am childless. At this point, Avram has no children of his own. Uven meshek beiti hu damesek Eliezer. Big dispute how to read ben meshek beiti. We'll take one direction, which is that there is a fellow who is my CFO, essentially the guy who runs my estate. Avram is fabulously wealthy. And this fellow is a Damasek Eliezer, which may mean he's a guy named Eliezer from Damascus. He's not a slave. He's not presented here as a slave. And by the way, it's the only time that this particular Eliezer shows up by name. And he's presented as Avraham's, the guy who runs Avraham's estate. Now, parenthetically, Avraham has been told already much earlier, you're going to have a great nation, and you're going to have a great bracha, and you're going to be very wealthy, and you're going to be the source of bracha for the world. And Avraham and Sarai, to whom he's extremely loyal, have no kids. And Sarai's getting older. And she still hasn't successfully become pregnant. And so Avraham seems to take several attempts to find an heir. Think about it. His first attempt is Lot. He adopts Lot and brings him with him, and Lot gets rich with Avraham in Egypt. But of course, that doesn't work because Lot and Avraham's shepherds have a fight, and Lot has to separate, and Lot goes his own way, and Lot now becomes an outsider living in Sodom. And of course, that whole story has a tragic end. Then the next one that Avram seems to think of as his heir is this Eliezer. And God turns around and says, no, it won't be Eliezer. And so what happens? Vayomer Avram, just to continue Avram's words, Hein li lo natata zara. You haven't given me any kids. Vinei ven beiti oreshoti. My houseboy, or this Eliezer, is going to be the one to inherit from me. Now, Hashem responds to that and says, that's also not the case. Lot was not the case. Eliezer is not the case. God speaks to him and says, Lo yirashcha zeh. This one will not inherit from you. Which means before you die, somebody else will come along who will be more fit to inherit you. It will be somebody who issues from your loins. In other words, it's going to be a biological child of yours who will inherit from you, not somebody who works for you. Okay, so the first two attempts at finding an heir are discarded. We're not going to go further in this story because, of course, who's the third attempt? The third attempt is Yishmael. And that only fails when Sarah insists that Yishmael be thrown out of the house after Yitzchak is born, and Hashem tells Avram to listen to her. And then Yitzchak becomes the proper heir. Now, by the way, that's not so smooth because Yitzchak as the proper heir doesn't really happen, or shall we say almost doesn't happen, because then Hashem perhaps tells Avram to slaughter Yitzchak, depending how you read the Akedah, which means 4 attempts and every one of them seems to fail. In any case, that's more about the Akedah for next week, but just want to point that out. Now watch what happens. Vayotzei oto achutza. Hashem takes Avram outside. Now, at this point, what time of day is it? The answer is we got no idea. We don't know. All we know is that Avram's having a vision. And so Hashem leads him outside. Vayomer habetna shamayma. And he says, look to the heavens. Usfor hakochavim, count the stars, im tuchal lisporotam, which you can't count. Try to count the stars, you can't. Which means, by the way, what time of day is this now? Anybody want to unmute and tell me?
You still don't know. It's inside the mechazeh.
What?
Well,
Okay.
if you're looking at the stars, it's night.
That's simply, it's nighttime. He takes him out and says, count the stars. You can't count the stars. And there, Vayomer lo ko yezarecha. And then he says, that's how many kids you'll have. Innumerable amount of kids, just like you can't count the stars. Very nice. So it's nighttime, we think. We're going to come back to the machazeh issue. Avram had faith in God. Avram trusted in God. And he considered it for him to be at tzedakah. Who considered what to be at tzedakah? Big machloket rishonim, not our problem. Now what happens next? Vayomer elav. Hashem speaks to him again. Ani Adonai shotzaticha mior kastim latet lecha ta'aretz hazot l'rishta. That should sound like a familiar line, by the way. I am Hashem who took you out of Ur Kasdim, the plain probably of the valley of the Chaldeans, to give you this land as an inheritance. Now, what's a little strange is that Hashem was already speaking here. So why does it say again, Ani Hashem? It sounds like this is a new speech. All right, Vayomar, Adonai Elohim, there's that name again, B'ma'ida ki irashena, which could be read 2 different ways, and there's a huge difference. One is, how do I know I'm going to inherit it? Meaning, prove it to me, which sounds like a real lack of belief. I mean, you're having a vision, and God's speaking to you, and God says, I'm going to give you this land, and you say, how do I know? The other way to read it, B'ma'ida, is functional. Not, how do I know it's going to happen, but by virtue of what will happen. Meaning, what's the mechanics of how it'll happen? All right, and that might be a more sympathetic. That is a more sympathetic way to read it, and that might be the more recommended way to read it. And so, what does Hashem answer? Vayomer elav, and here we're going to get to the Batarim. So, just one quick introduction, which is actually one prologue and one introduction that are necessary to understand this. First one is a general statement about methodology of the study of Tanakh. When you're studying Tanakh, unless you, first of all, admit to something, which is that Tanakh is written in a particular generation reflecting a particular culture and particular time, and it is the job of the Masorah to translate it in every generation into a message that is meaningful for that generation. But unless you admit that Tanakh is written in a particular context, you're never going to get it. So if you expect a marriage in Tanakh to look like a marriage today, you're just not going to understand anything that's going on. Which leads to the second piece is you really need to familiarize yourself with anthropology, the way that people lived, the way societies existed in the Middle East in this time, in the 2nd millennium BCE, to understand what's going on. I'll give you an example. In Tanakh, we have marriages between men who are in their 40s and up and girls who are 12. To us, that sounds criminal. It actually is criminal. And to us, it sounds disgusting, and we think of it as disgusting. And yet, in the ancient world, that was the norm. Because a girl, the minute that she was able to bear children, would get married so that she could bear children, because you don't want to waste childbearing years. And because of infant mortality, et cetera, a lot of reasons. And a man can only get married when he has enough capital to support a family. He might have to work for 20, 30 years until he has enough money to be able to get married and have kids. So it's a very, very different. That's because marriage was a very different thing in those days. It wasn't about high school sweethearts. It was about connecting clans and connecting tribes together and diplomatic reasons, et cetera. All right. So in the same way, it's valuable to know how agreements were made in the time of Tanakh to understand the story. And I'll give you an example of that. And how the Tanakh is sensitive to its multi-generational message. In Megillat Ruth, you're all, I assume, familiar generally with the story of Megillat Ruth, if not in detail. In the last parak of Megillat Ruth, Ruth parak Daled, there is a scene between Boaz, who is our protagonist, and a fellow whose name we'll never know. We call him Ploni Almoni, John Doe. And Boaz is trying to get Ploni Almoni, who has the first rights to the property of the family, to back out and give those rights to Boaz. Background of that is way beyond our scope. He gets the Ploni Almoni to agree to give up his claim and to let Boaz buy the property and marry Ruth. Then there's this pasuk Zayin, if you want to look it up, Parak Daled, pasuk Zayin. V'zot lefanim b'Yisrael. It's an interjection. You're reading a story, and in the middle, there's this little historic footnote, which is, in the old days, when a person wanted to sign an agreement or fulfill any sort of an agreement or a testimony, the way they would do it is he would take off his shoe. Now, it's very unclear whose shoe was taken off by whom, but he would take off, there was a shoe being taken off. And you have no idea why this pasuk is there until the very next pasuk says that Ploni says to Boaz, you can buy the field, and he took off his shoe. And again, we don't know whose shoe. In other words, the reader of the story, if he didn't have that interjected pasuk, would have no idea what's going on. Yeah, you can buy the field, here's the shoe. And you say, what does the shoe have to do with anything? And the reason is because by the time Megillat Ruth is completed, which is evidently a couple hundred years after the story, the custom of using a shoe was not only not out of vogue, but nobody even remembered it. And the text has to tell you, oh, this is the way they did things. So you'll understand the story. There's several other examples of that in Tanakh, historic interjections that make the text clear. And so Tanakh says, we want you to understand the story. To understand the story, familiarize yourself with the local customs of the time. Okay. So if we open up, and fortunately we don't have to go outside of Tanakh, we have it explicitly in Tanakh. If you open up Yirmiyahu Lamed Daled, Jeremiah 34, you will see, and this is, by the way, the Haftarah of Parshat Bahar, you will see a diatribe against people who made an agreement to let their Hebrew slaves go after 6 years, and then welched on the agreement and took them back. And how did they make that agreement? They walked between the halves of the calf. What does that mean? Bein bitrei ha'ego. What does that mean? The answer is that we know from other sources that in the Near East, including in Am Yisrael, when people made an agreement, the way they did it is they took an animal, they cut it in half, they put the two halves away from each other, and they sat in the middle. The two parties to the agreement sat in the middle. They often had a meal and made their agreement. And the implication was, either of us who violates the agreement, this will happen to him. He'll be cut in half. And that was the sense. And so you would go, or you'd either walk or sit, bein bitrei ha'ego. All right, that's the background. Now let's see what happens. Hashem says to Avram, Chal li egla meshuleshet, pasuk tet, ve'ez meshuleshet v'ayom meshulash v'tor v'gozal. Hashem says to Avram, take an eglah. Eglah is a female calf, an ez is a goat, and an ayel is a ram. And the word mishulash here, big machloket rishonim, whether it means take a really fat ram, and typically the third of the litter is the fattest, or whether it means 3 of them. So either way, either he's taking 3 mammals or 9 mammals, and 2 birds, 2 doves. Now, not coincidentally, these are the only animals that ever go on the Mizbeach. Goats, sheep, and cows, if you were, bovines, and those two birds. And now that's what he tells Avram to take. Vaikach lo et kol eila. I'm going to walk on both directions of 3 animals of each or 1 fat one of each. Vaikach lo et kol eila. Avram takes these animals. Vayivater otam batavech. He cuts them in half, which may mean that he cut every one of them, even all 9 of them in half, or it may mean that he put the rams and he cut the middle ram in half, and so there's 1.5 rams there, 1.5 rams there, like that, maybe. Or if there's only 3 animals, he cut each one of them in half. In any case, we've got some half animals there. Vayitain ish bitroli krat reu, and he faced the halves facing each other. So there's like bookends. Right? V'atatzipor lo batar. He didn't cut the bird. He didn't cut the bird for several reasons. Maybe because it's too small. Vayered ha'ayet al apgarim. This is all deeply symbolic. A vulture comes down to eat the carcasses. Vayashev otam Avram. Vayashev is a word that you all know because 2 weeks ago we started saying mashiv haruach. Vayashev otam Avram. Avram shoos them away. And now vahi Hashem shlavo. And this is the pasuk that drives really crazy. Vahi Hashem shlavo. The sun was about to set, or had set. V'tardemana flal Avram, and a deep, deep sleep fell on Avram. A deep fear and darkness falls on Avram. And now what happens? Vayomer Avram, and then those the 4 psukim of the Brit Ben Abatarim. So in this very deep sleep, sitting or lying between these 2 halves of the animals, which means he's making a brit, Hashem promises him that his descendants are going to be slaves for a long time in a foreign country, but Hashem will punish the people who enslave them, and they will leave with great wealth, and they'll return to this land, etc. Right? Okay. And that's the Brit Ben Abatarim. And now, Vahi Hashemesh Ba'a, as the sun is fully set, Valatahaya became very dark. Suddenly, there is a smoky kiln or oven and a fiery torch that appears between these 2 sets of animals. In other words, Avram is between the animals, and now the fire representing God is between the animals, and there's a brit being made between God and Avraham. And now we now complete it. Bayomahu karata Adonai Avram brit. More on that day, Hashem made a brit with Avram. Now you understand, by the way, why the verb associated with a brit is lisrot brit, to cut a brit, because the way a brit is made is by cutting animals, and of course brit milah. I have given your children this land, and he gives them the broad Eretz Yisrael, what we call greater Eretz Yisrael borders of basically somewhere in Egypt, either Wadi El Arish or the Nile Delta, all the way to the Euphrates. So 10 nations are mentioned there, 7 of whom we're familiar with from Eretz Yisrael, and 3 from more in Jordan. Okay, that's the story. Now, as you can see here, there is, and you can see it color-coded, there is a sequencing problem, which is, it starts off, and in the first few verses, it seems to be nighttime. And Hashem takes him outside and said, count the stars. At nighttime. Can't count them. Oh, that's how many kids you'll have. And in the very next passage, we have a very elaborate scene which concludes with sunset, which is why I gave you those 2 paintings at the beginning. Which is it? By the way, I hope it works that the white text with the black background looks like nighttime, and the red text with the yellow background looks like sunset. It's as close as I could get. So there's a sequencing problem because last time I checked, sunset happens before nighttime. All right. So there are prima facie 2 easy ways to get around this. I think it was Joyce who mentioned one of them earlier. I think you did, right? Which is, and the word that I marked in blue, is this is a machazeh. Now remember, if you're the Rambam, and we're not going to be addressing the Rambam's approach to this here, but I just want to get it mentioned at the beginning, is if you're the Rambam, your hardline take is that anytime a person has a prophecy, if their name is not Moshe and their last name is not Rabbeinu, then they are asleep. and it's a dream. And he bases that on the passage in Bamidbar Perak Yud Bet. Im Achem Adonai Bamara Elav et Vadav Chalam Odaber Bo. Lo Chen Avdi Moshe. That Moshe's Nevuah is qualitatively superior at a whole different degree, a whole different type than any other Navi. And he codifies that as one of the 13 principles that you have to believe that Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah, principle number 7, is of a superior and different, distinct quality from everybody else. Now, Avram is not Moshe Rabbeinu, so it's very easy to picture. Avram is having a vision, and in the vision, you can have nighttime followed by sunset, followed by summer, and then winter a half a minute later. It's a vision. You could have anything. So that's one easy way to solve this, which means this entire thing is happening in a vision. There is a problem with that, and that is that if you recall, in Pasuk Yud Bet, a deep sleep falls over Avraham. Now, that would mean, and this is not impossible, but that would mean that Avraham is asleep. He's having a vision. In the vision, Hashem says, I'm giving you a reward. Avram says, what's the point? I got no kids. Hashem says, go outside, count the stars. Eliezer, go out, count the stars. And he sees himself at night counting the stars. And that's how many kids you'll have because you can't count the stars. And then in the vision, it suddenly becomes sunset. It was earlier, but it's a vision, that's okay. But then in the middle of that vision, he goes into a deep sleep, which means he's having a vision inside of a vision. Now, it's not impossible, and we have an example of that in Zechariah Daled, the famous vision of the menorah, is a vision within a vision. But it's a little difficult, it's a little pushy to say that. There is yet another way to do it, which is really remarkable, it's beautiful, and it's certainly not pshat. A fellow told me this many years ago, pulled me aside once Shabbat morning, Lech-Lecha, I think, and he pointed this problem out. He said, here, Hashem says to Abraham, go count the stars. Can you count them? And then afterwards it's sunset. So he says, that means this was said during the day. And then he turned to me and said, how many stars do you see during the day? So you don't have to unmute yourself, just show me with your fingers. How many stars do you see during the day? Right? The answer is actually one. And that's the sun. Now, all the stars are there, but you can't see them. And that he was saying to Avram, you're going to have billions of descendants, but you're only going to see one in your lifetime. And beautifully in English, it works. The sun is his son. Right? Very nice. Cute. It's a cute chap. It clearly is not shot for the simple reason that the whole point of the inability to count the stars is the fact that they're innumerable. In other words, if he's going out and it's daytime, it says, can you count them? Yeah, one. That's easy. Or I can't count them because I can't see them, in which case Hashem should say, can you see them? You can't see them, you won't see, but you'll have kids. So the simple shot of this is that it's actually really happening and it's nighttime and he's seeing stars. So now we have our problem that I mentioned, which is one of sequence. How do you have nighttime with stars followed by sunset, right? Okay, I'm not able to deal with the chats. What I'll try to do is end about 5 minutes early and we'll go through the chats and take your questions. I apologize. I'm really not a good multitasker that way. Okay, so this problem is not something I made up. It's not my friend at Young Israel made it up. Shul made it up. It's actually something that the Rishonim were quite sensitive to. Well, let's start with Rashi, because we always start with Rashi, right? Now, first of all, Rashi on the spot says, Vayotzei oto achutza, meaning, Hapshat hotzio me'ohalo el achutz lerot hakochavim. In other words, even though there is an agadah, that Vayotzei oto achutza means that Hashem lifted Avraham above the stars, or he told him not to pay attention to his astrologers. Rashi says, Pshat is he took him outside to see the stars. Which means, according to Rashi, straightforward, this is nighttime. Okay? Now, we look at the, and that approach of Rashi simply bypasses the problem. And the only way that you might be able to make it work, and Rashi doesn't say this, is to take my friend's ideas. It was daytime. And he went outside and he couldn't count stars because he couldn't see them, etc. But again, that's very difficult. Rashi does not deal with this problem. but almost everybody else does. Let's take a look at the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra has another take. And you know what? The Ibn Ezra has another take. Vahi hashemesh ba'a. This is later in the text when the sun starts to set, meaning after the nighttime thing. And there, Ibn Ezra says, V'zel lanu la'ot, here's the sign, Ki vayikach lo et kol eile biyom echad achar shekitz machazeh nevuah. Ibn Ezra has a very simple solution. The story that we're reading takes place over 2 days. It starts one night, and at night he goes out and counts the stars, and then he goes to sleep, and the next day in the late afternoon he has another vision, and then the sun sets, and that's how it works. It's very simple. Everything in the text is in order. Everything in the text is real. It's really nighttime. It's really sunset. It's really stars. And what's missing from the text is that there's a gap between Pasuk Vav and Pasuk Zayin of overnight and the next day and the next afternoon. Okay. Somebody who many of you may not be familiar with, who only really became popular in the last 30 years or so, is Rabbi Yosef Bechor Shor, Rabbi Joseph of Orleans, who was a student of Rabbeinu Tam, and wrote a magnificent commentary on Chumash that we've always had. People were always aware of it. It's not newly discovered, but it's been newly popularized. It's in the Haketer set on Mikra Gedolot, and it's available on Al Torah, of course, along with everything else in the world. And it's really a magnificent commentary and innovative and really impressive. He says the following: "Ve'ralo hakochavim bayom," right? "B'machazeh kamo b'chalom." So, in other words, he took him out. It's day, but he's seeing the actual stars because it's b'machazeh b'chalom. Ki adayin haya yom ko shomer kan v'haya shemesh lavo. So he says everything happens in order, and simply he shows him the kochavim in the vision during the day, not the sun, but kochavim, but it's a vision, meaning during the day he has that vision, which means he doesn't take him outside and look up. It's happening in a vision. That, of course, runs into our problem of a vision within a vision. Now, the Radak, Reb David Kimchi, and we know something about the Kimchi family. Kimchi family came from Spain. They ran away and went to Provence, lived in Narbonne in Provence. And the Kimchi family was a very prodigious family in Parshanut and in Dikduk. And there's a famous saying, Im en Kimchi en Torah. Without the Kimchi family, we really can't understand things. He says, B'machazeh, Amar Hine, B'machazeh, because in the Machazeh it say, Hine, behold, there's the Hashem speaks to him. From our B'chol Davar Asher Diber Imo, why is this called a machazeh? Because it's not just God's words, there's a vision. There's things he sings, stars, etc. Right? So all of these things are now as visions. That's the point. Now he continues on, says, meaning he's in his tent, this nevuah comes, he takes him out. He's still having the nevuah, which means, according to him, he's really outside. It's really nighttime, and he's looking at the stars. Now, here we go. Still the Radak. He goes back to Joyce's point, and he says this entire thing is a prophecy, meaning it's all a vision. It's not real, meaning it's not really happening. If you videotaped Avram, you see him sleeping. So the beginning, he takes him out to count the stars. That's nighttime. And then it says the sun is setting. Because it's becoming nighttime. So he said the whole thing's a vision. And you'll see anybody here color-coded with blue takes that position, right? The Chizkuni, that's Rabbi Chizkiah Manoach of northern France. In the 13th century, the Ramban says, Hayad Rashem al Avram b'machazel lemor, that Avram now merited to have actually a vision, because originally it was just like speech at night, and now he's actually seeing things. All right, and we even see it in later commentaries. Moshe Tedeschi from 19th century Italy says, Achar dvei ma'ileh, pasuk zeh katuv b'machazeh, v'lo yigid lanu mi'Avraham hekitz b'machazehu. He brings a point to prove the idea that this entire thing is a vision, and therefore don't get worried about the sequence of night and day. Don't worry, we're going to have a much more innovative approaches. But I want you to see how many people immediately glommed onto the word machazeh, which is why I highlighted it, to indicate that this entire thing is a vision. So it can be backwards, it can be night, then day, day, then night, doesn't matter. And he says, he wasn't awake, and therefore it could be nighttime, and then a minute later it could be sunset of the next day, or just a sunset. Right? Now he addresses my question. Don't be bothered by the fact that afterwards it says that Avram went to sleep, if the whole thing is in a vision. He makes the argument that a machazeh is one level of prophecy and a tardema is another one. So first he had a machazeh, and then within the machazeh he had tardema. By the way, a problem that many people have is, how could Avram say to God, how do I know I'm going to inherit it? What, you don't believe me? Don't ask the question, because this is all part of the prophecy, meaning Avram doesn't actually say the words. In the prophecy, he sees himself saying the words. God put that question in his mouth in the vision, so he could tell him the brit. Right? And he goes on from there. Shadal, Shmuel David Luzzatto, late 19th century in Italy, Padua, says the following, again, V'tardema keya er, meaning Avram was awake when the sleep fell on him, o b'machazeh haya, or maybe this is part of the vision. Uvalo tardemata nevuah v'imalo geol mata machazeh. In other words, this is such a deep vision that it goes from machazeh into tardema. In other words, everybody in this group that we just seen, from the Bechor Shor, the Radak, the Chizkuni, the Ramban, Moshe Tedeschi, Shadal, all take the position that the solution to the sequence problem is simply one of, this is a machazeh. And if it's a machazeh, it's a vision. I'm not bothered by sequence and time. Time can be played with. It's all a vision. That's not the end of the road. Let's stay in the 19th century. Somebody who was a great scholar, he was part of the Orthodox Frankfurt community. Parenthetically, he was, I believe, the founder. He was certainly one of the heads of Agudas Yisrael when it was formed. Was Reb David Tzvi Hoffman. Reb David Tzvi Hoffman, by the way, also earned a doctorate in the University of Berlin. He wrote a doctorate on Mar Shmuel, the Amora. And he published some very significant works, including things that even today are considered fresh research, the Midrash Tanaim and other important works that he identified. And he wrote a commentary on Sefer Vayikra, which is invaluable, although it's dated. It was a response to biblical criticism. And he wrote it in German. It was translated into Hebrew. I think it's translated in English. In any case, Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman, also an innovative thinker, says, Vaya Shemesh, he said, Mikan Shabrit Zu Nichrata Bayom. He doesn't buy that this whole thing's in a vision. It's really happening. And the sun setting means the sun's really setting. So he says, if that's the case, then this brit was actually made during the day. Liumata Dibura Kodem, as opposed to the previous one, which happened at night. Obviously it's night because he's counting stars. In other words, Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman, who knows all these people who've said machazeh and it's a vision and don't care, he said no. The text says count stars, that's night, and the text says sun is setting, that's day. Pasuk vav me'aveh afsaka b'chol libo batach Avram b'Hashem nulo l'machorat havtacha mechudeshet. What does Rabbi Tzvi Hoffman say? He basically says, again, this is green, like the Ibn Ezra, which is that the first half of our story, I'll show it to you again, the first 6 verses happen at night. And verse 7 starts a new vision the next day. And the text melds them. Right? So far we have 2 major approaches, and then Rashi just seems to bypass the problem. And now we get to the Rashbam. A couple words about the Rashbam, because he deserves a couple of words. Rashbam, Shmuel bar Meir, as you know, Rashi's grandson, Unlike Rabbeinu Tam, his younger brother, the Rashbam was old enough to actually study at his grandfather's feet, and he himself records numerous times that he challenged Rashi about Rashi's understanding, Rashi's explanation of things, and at times he records that Rashi admitted that he should have written another commentary or modified his commentary. The Rashbam, and there's just something interesting about popularity and about the essentially democratic nature of scholarship. Before the 15th century, because the 15th century, of course, is the most dramatic revolution probably in the history of man, which is the printing press. At least since in the last 2,000 years, probably the biggest revolution until the digital revolution, which is the printing press. Before that time, if you wanted a book, what did you have to do? You had to be rich, and you had to find a copyist, unless you yourself were a copyist, and you have to pay him a lot of money, and then he'd have to have access to a copy, a reliable copy of the book, and then he would spend however long it took, months, maybe years, to copy the book. So there weren't a whole lot of copies out there of specific commentaries because it cost a lot of money. Rashi, to let you know, Rashi was so popular that we have in our hands over 200 manuscripts of Perush Rashi and Chumash. That's how popular he was. There are so many manuscripts around because people would copy and make copies of Rashi. Everybody wanted to have Rashi. By the way, the first Hebrew book printed, as far as we know, and as you know, at the beginning of printing, Hebrew books was a major part of that enterprise because there were a lot of buyers. The first Hebrew book printed was Chumash with Rashi. That's how popular he was. On the other hand, the Rashbam was not nearly as popular. And we have one manuscript of the Rashbam, one. And part of that manuscript was lost. And from the middle of Perek Aleph through Perek Tetvav, which means what we're looking at is a passage that we don't have the Rashbam's commentary on. However, there was an enterprise undertaken a number of years ago to restore the Rashbam. How could you do that? You can't make it up. The answer is the Rashbam in his day was actually quite popular. And all sorts of colleagues quoted him. And so researchers went into collections of North French commentaries on Chumash and found comments of the Rashbam that were quoted by others. They pulled them out, and they have what we call the reconstructed Rashbam, or the Rashbam HaMishuchzar. So all the Rashbams we have from the middle of chapter 1 in Breshit all the way through this chapter, afterwards we have the text, are Rashbam HaMishuchzar. Just to let you know, it's an interesting side note. The Rashbam takes the following approach. He says, B'machazeh, meaning B'chazon Laila. He has a vision at night. That's at the beginning of the chapter. Sivalo Notakochem. How do we know it's night? Because he told him, go out and count the stars. So that's interesting. Because he's not reading Machazeh the way you and I read it before, but rather, Machazeh means he has a vision. And in the vision, God says, you're going to have a great reward. Avram says, what do you mean? And the kids say, and then Avram says, go outside. And he gets up and goes outside and counts the stars. And it's nighttime and he can't count them. And he says, Usfor HaKochavim, in source 14, Mashma Shehu Laila, meaning it's nighttime. V'tema v'hakatuv farin v'hi Hashem eshtavo. He asks our question. Wait a second. Right afterwards it says, the sun's setting. L'manu shayayom, it's day. Ella, watch this. Now remember, how did the Ibn Ezra solve this? It was the next day. The first vision is at night, and then take a break, and the next day, and then we get to sunset. He has Ein Mukdam Muchar B'Torah. I'm sure you're all familiar with that phrase, but just to make sure, I'll explain it. Ein Mukdam Muchar B'Torah is a principle that the Gemara states in Masechet Pesachim, and it essentially means that you cannot automatically assume that a passage in the Torah happened after a passage that's earlier than it in the text. There may be passages that show up earlier that really happen later. But of course, anytime that happens, there's going to be a very good reason for it. Now, among the Rishonim, almost all of them adopted this approach. And for instance, Rashi and Ibn Ezra took the approach that the command to build the Mishkan was a response to the Egel. Now remember, the Mishkan is commanded in Shemot 25, and the Egel is told about in Shemot 32. And yet, the Mishkan is a response to the Egel, because Ein Muktam Muchar B'Torah, and several other examples. The big champion of the position of Yesh Muktam Muchar B'Torah, which means the Torah is chronologically accurate, is the Ramban. But there's certain places the Ramban has to back down. There's nothing you could do about the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar, because chapter 1 in Bamidbar happens on the second month of the first year, and chapter 9 it states explicitly on the first month of the first year. You can't do anything of the second year. You can't do anything about that. But that's the Ramban. The Rashbam is not bothered by that. So he says these two stories don't have to have happened in the order that they're presented. So he agrees with Ibn Ezra that after verse 7 is a different story, but he says they're out of order, which means that Brit Ben Abatarim happened first, and only afterwards did Hashem say to Avram, you have a big reward, and Avram said, what's the point? I have no kids. He said, go outside and count the stars. But the Rashbam is going to build a much bigger, more beautiful building than that. Watch. At the beginning of the second vision, as it were, he says, Vayomer Elav Ani Adonai Asher Tziticha Me'ur Kasdim, I am Hashem who took you out of Ur Kasdim in order to give you this land to inherit, right? So he says the first 6 verses were said at night. And he says, Machazeh means Chezyon Laila, a night vision. He told him to go out and count the stars. It's nighttime. The rest of this is daytime. When you create Parshat Brit Ben Abatarim, what do we call the whole second part from verse 7 on? Brit Ben Abatarim. Parshat Shavua. Get ready for this. It came earlier than the above mentioned one, earlier. You ready for that? Rashbam says that the second half of our chapter, verse 7 to the end, happened 5 years earlier than the first part of the chapter. Where do you get 5 years from? He's going to tell you. And then he's got to explain, of course, why they're out of order. What does it say? Now remember, many Rishonim take the 400 years literally. And he says, your kids are going to be enslaved, right, for 400 years. And he says, what that means is, mi Yitzchak va'elach, from the time that you have Yitzchak, it'll be 400 years. Be'eretz Olam, they'll be enslaved for 400 years. And by the way, what does it say when Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim? It says after 430 years. That's a big difficulty in the text. Meaning, he says, Lizman Brit Ben Abatarim. He resolves it very simply. We were taken out of Egypt 430 years after this Brit. In other words, 400 years after the birth of Yitzchak. Now, Yitzchak was born when Avram was 100, which means how old is Avram here? 70. Yatsu calls it right. Based on that interpretation, and that means you're taking 400 years literally, it means you're saying the 400 years only start when Yitzchak is born, and the 430 mentioned at the Exodus go back to this date, and that means this event happened 30 years before Yitzchak was born, which means Avram is 70. Well, so far, that's fine. A number of assumptions, but he's making them. Avram was 100 when Yitzchak was born. That we have in the text. So Avram is 70. Now, by the way, if you remember at the beginning of our Parsha, Lech-Lecha, it says that when Avram came to Israel, he was 75. All right, so watch what he says. Shayak shiatza micharan pam rishona. And the Rashbam tells us something that we never knew otherwise. That Avram left Haran up in Turkey to come to Israel twice. He was 70 the first time. Pam rishona kshemarlo parsha shalachar dvei ma'ila ya ben chamesh v'shivim shana. And then, when he came down the second time, should be, the beginning of our Parsha happened, meaning the Brit Ben Abatarim happened when he was 70. And he's going to give us the whole layout. Kimlan b'Seder Olam. Seder Olam, the Midrashic history of the Tanakh, says, Ben Arba'im U'Shmona Shana, what's the math? Hayah ba'Flaga, that Avram, according to this tradition, was 48 years old when the tower happened. And then they count from right that point, the 12 years that the people of that area of Sodom etc., were enslaved to Kedar LaOmer. Shana Maradu, Arbasre Shana Ba Kedar LaOmer, and 14 years later, after a 14-year rebellion, the kings came. So that means that there's 26 years in there. Sim Chavav Elo Arbeimushmona, and add that to the 48 of how old Avram was, and that means he's 74. In other words, at the time of the war, Avram was 74 or 75-ish. And it says that Avram was 75 when he left Haran, and he says that must mean the second time. Right? And so there, what happened? After he killed the kings, or he went to war and defeated them, Hashem comes and says, don't worry, you have a big reward at the beginning of our parsha. And as he says, that happens when Avram's 75. Don't worry, you have a big reward. Avram says, I don't have any kids. Go outside, count the stars. That's how many kids you'll have. Boom. All right? Ela ein mukdam muchar b'Torah. And then he says, V'nismacha parshat brit b'tarim kan kedei lechaber et haparshiot b'asar Avram b'zera. Why did the text put these two things that are 5 years apart together? Because they have a common thread, which is they're both about Avram being promised a lot of kids and the land. And so therefore the Torah put these two together, right? And now he brings another proof, and I'll just mention it to you. Derech Hagav, there's a Gemara in Brachot, at the beginning of Brachot, that has an interesting observation. It says, from the time the world was created, nobody ever called Hashem Adon. Aleph, Daled, Vav, Nun. Now, when we say Hashem's name, that's how we say it, Adonai. We don't say God's real name. On Yom Kippur, when the Kohen Gadol would do it, we'd all bow down. We don't know how to say Hashem's proper name, so we call him that. But we don't spell it that way. We spell it with a Yod and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey, which means we assume Avram is actually saying it that way. But here it says Aleph, Daled, Nun, Yod, which means Avram saying that. And the Gemara says, from the time of creation, nobody called Hashem Adon until Avram came along and said, watch this, right here, Adonai Elohim, and they quote this pasuk, B'mai Daki Rashana. The first time anybody called him that. Please look up a bit, and what does it say right here in the second verse? Whoops. And so the Rashbam's point is, if this happened earlier, they should have quoted this and said, that's the first time somebody called him that. Why does the Gemara quote this verse, verse 8? Because that's the first time somebody called him Adon, because this happened earlier. That's his proof. Now, what I wanted to show you over the course of this 55 minutes or so is that we have a difficulty in the text, which the Chachamim are all sensitive to. We have a story, a vital story of Hashem speaking to Abraham that happens seemingly at night. If we erase the machazeh component, it happens at night. And our fancy explanation about stars. It happens at night. On the other hand, it's immediately followed by a story that happens clearly, if we read the text at face value, it happens clearly at the end of the day. And so there are four solutions to it. One solution was sort of to avoid the problem. Rashi seems to ignore the problem. He doesn't address it. One solution is to take the word machazeh and turn that into a guide word for the whole thing and say this entire thing is a vision. And yes, we have a problem with that, because then where's the tardema inside the vision, the deep sleep inside the vision? It's difficult. But if you take that, then all your problems go away, because time is meaningless and order is meaningless, and stars can bounce back and forth, and they can spell out, Dodgers won World Series. They can do anything you want. Sorry, we're still celebrating. There is then, of course, the Ibn Ezra. And the Ibn Ezra and David Tzvi Hoffman say that the story that we have didn't happen on the same day. It's in order, but the first thing happened one night, and the next day is the second part of the vision. That solves the problem. It just means that there's a gap in there that's not mentioned. It seems to flow directly. And then we have what seems to be the most revolutionary approach, which is the Rashbam. Rashbam turns around and says, these are two different visions, two different messages. And by the way, with this, he solves a big problem. They're two different messages. And And the second one, the Brit Ben Abatarim, is what happened first when Avram was 70 and he came to the land the first time. Because what does Hashem say at the beginning of that? I am Hashem who took you out of Ur Kasdim. Now, Avram left Ur Kasdim and went to Haran. But according to this, he just got there from Ur Kasdim and came to Israel. Then he went back to Haran. And then 5 years later, Hashem said, Lech-Lecha. And when he was 75. And that's when he did the war. And his math with the war may work out. And the Rashbam's math. And then right after the war, Hashem appears to him at the beginning of our chapter and says, don't worry, meaning don't worry about the kings. You just fought the war, don't worry about it. Very nice. So that's the Rashbam's take. There's something else the Rashbam gains here, and he says so. If you recall, the first thing that happens is Hashem comes to, reading in order, Hashem comes to Avram and says, big reward. Avram says, what's the point? He says, don't worry, you're going to have kids, go outside, count the stars. And Avram believes him. In the next line, Hashem says, I took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you the land. And Avram says, Bama eda ki rashana. How do I know I'm going to get it? Now, Rashi and others say Bama is mechanical. Not meaning, how do I know I'm going to get it, but by virtue of what? Like, how will it happen? And the answer seems to be korbanot. But the Rashbam says, simple pshat, Bama eda ki rashana, meaning, how do I know I'm going to get it? Which is a weird thing to say 2 psukim after the text lauds Avram for his faith in God. But according to the Rashbam, it's not a problem. Because according to the Rashbam, this story happened first. Which means the first thing that happened is Avram gets to Canaan, and Avram says, I am Hashem, I took you out of Ur Kasdim to give you this land. And Avram says, how do I know I'm going to get it? And we have the whole Brit Ben Abatarim. And 5 years later, Avram turns around to Hashem and says, I still have no kids. What's the point of giving me the land? I got no one to hand it to. And he says, oh, go count the stars. And that's how many kids you'll have. Okay, we have a couple minutes. If somebody wants to ask any questions, please just unmute yourselves. Even if you put it in the chat, just ask away.
Hi, thank you so much.
Which one do you vote for?
Which one do I vote for? I'm not going to put my head between the Rishonim like that. I just think it's a delightful machloket Rishonim. And you know, if we can get to the point where we can fully appreciate the different approaches to this and kind of what drives those approaches, then we're in a great place. If we had more time, we don't, but if we had more time, I would spend some time with you trying to explore why these different approaches exist, like what drives the Ibn Ezra to say what he's saying, and what drives the Rashbam to say the way he's saying. There's something behind why they're choosing to go that way, and they're all familiar with what earlier authorities said, and they have a different take for a reason. But me, who am I? I don't know. I'm just a guy who shares the information with you.
Does Rashbam have any other explanation for Avram coming earlier?
Yeah, so he bases it on Seder Olam, which is odd because Seder Olam is the famous midrashic development of a chronography from the beginning of creation all the way until Rabbi Yossi's time, in the past Bar Kochba. And Seder Olam is the source of many of the midrashim that we have about different people in Tanakh meeting that don't meet in Tanakh, and the ages and all of that sort of stuff. And he quotes Seder Olam as saying that Avram came twice, once when he was 70, once when he was 75, which is driven by commentary on the contradiction between 400 years and 430 years. And 430 years, if we say it's really 430 years that they left, that's 430 years from what? And so the way that they reconcile it is it's 400 years since Yitzchak was born, because that's when the clock starts ticking. That's when Avram has kids that count for this. So it must have been 30 years earlier that something else happened, and that's this. Right. But it's difficult. Okay. Anyhow,
So
enjoy.
why isn't his question chutzpahnik? If he's a mamin, why is he asking that question?
Which one?
The one about how will I know that I'll have?
How will I know? Good. So again, if the question is like you're presenting it, and like, by the way, the Rashbam reads it and others read it, which is really, how do I know I'm going to get it? then we have a problem and I'll address it. Most Rishonim read it Bameda as a functional one, meaning what's the vehicle through which it'll be gotten. But if you read it that way, you're right. It sounds very chutzpahdik, like Mapitom, God said I'm going to give it to you. Why don't you trust him? So some of the Rishonim, picking up on the Gemara and Brachot, say it is the way of tzaddikim to never be too sure about their own merits. And when God promises something to them, to still be unsure. You see this with Yaakov all the time, because they feel that maybe they were given that promise when they were behaving appropriately, and maybe since then they sinned. And it's a sign of their humility that they may indeed be that of their greatness, that they're always unsure of their greatness. And so, Bamei Dakir Hashanah may not mean I don't trust you, but give me something that I can hold on to. Because otherwise, if it's a promise without a brit, then the promise I might lose it. If there's a brit, there's a brit. So that may be what it is. Otherwise, it's a good question. But Avram speaks his mind. He's comfortable speaking his mind to God, right?
Your friend's suggestion that there's one star, the sun, out during the day. Does the Tanakh consider the sun a star?
Yeah, good point. So I think that's another reason why it doesn't work. I think you're right. It doesn't work. It's just really cute.
Right.
Like when he told it to me, I said, "Oh, that's so cute." I shared it with people, but we all with a smile saying, "That's a really cute idea." It's not pshat.
Right.
And I think your point is good, is well taken. All right, everybody, have a wonderful Shabbat. Delightful learning with you, and we'll see you next time.